Blood froze on Nizhoni's hands as she fought off snarling wolves to rescue a settler's abandoned newborn from certain death in the blizzard. 3 days later, those same hands were bound behind her back as the child's remarkable recovery became proof of her unholy witchcraft to a town hungry for someone to blame. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter of 1742 descended upon Harrowfield like a vengeful spirit, bringing with it winds that cut through the thickest wool and snow that buried the world in silent white. The forest that surrounded the small Massachusetts settlement seemed to grow denser, darker with each passing day, as if nature itself sought to reclaim what had been taken from it. Most settlers huddled by their hearths, whispering prayers that their meager stores would last until spring's distant promise. At the edge of that fearsome forest, where the trees grew too close for comfort and shadows lingered even at midday, stood a small cabin built of weathered logs and river stone. Smoke curled from its chimney in defiance of the cold, a testament to the resilience of its sole inhabitant. Nizhoni moved silently through her home, 26 years of life etched into the gentle lines at the corners of her eyes. Her movements were practiced, efficient as she hung bundles of dried herbs from the ceiling beams, sage, sweetgrass, and plants whose names the settlers had never bothered to learn. Her slender fingers, strong from years of gathering and grinding, worked with quiet precision. The firelight caught the intricate patterns of the tattoo that marked her right wrist, a spiral of protection gifted to her when she had become her people's healer. She was Abenaki, the last of her family to remain in these lands that had once belonged entirely to her people. The others had moved north and west as the English settlements spread like mold across bread. But Nizhoni had stayed, drawn by something she could not name, perhaps the whispers of the ancient pines or the memories buried beneath the soil. The forest still needs its keeper, her grandmother had told her before death claimed her 3 winters past. And these blind people need someone who can see. Outside, the wind howled its discontent, rattling the shutters Nizhoni had crafted herself. She paused in her work, listening to the message carried on that bitter breath. More snow coming, heavier this time. She would need to gather more firewood before nightfall. Wrapping herself in a thick cloak lined with rabbit fur, she stepped outside. The cold assaulted her immediately, but she had been born in these winters and knew their language intimately. Nizhoni bent her head against the wind and made her way to the woodpile, covered carefully with oilcloth to keep the logs dry. In the distance, barely visible through the veil of swirling snow, the smoke from Harrowfield's chimneys rose into the grey sky. 27 families now, nearly 200 souls huddled together for protection against the wilderness and its imagined terrors. They tolerated Nizhoni's presence at the forest's edge. Barely. Some came to her in desperation when their remedies failed, slipping through the trees at dusk with downcast eyes and hushed voices, seeking the healing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of her people. They called her the Indian woman when they were being polite, the witch when they were not. Nizhoni gathered an armload of wood, her breath forming clouds that were immediately torn apart by the wind. As she turned back toward her cabin, she caught sight of a figure moving along the path that connected her isolated home to the settlement. The shape resolved into the tall, gaunt form of Reverend Samuel Hayes, his black coat flapping around his legs like the wings of a crow. Her heart sank. The Reverend never brought good tidings. "Miss Nizhoni," he called, his voice carrying the nasal quality of Boston education. He refused to use her tribal name alone, always attaching an English title that felt like an ill-fitting garment. Reverend Hayes. She nodded, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "You're far from town in this weather." The Lord's work knows no season. His pale eyes surveyed her cabin, lingering on the bundles of herbs visible through the open door. His nostrils flared slightly, either from the cold or disapproval. Ahmad, the town council has concerns. They always do. Nizhoni shifted the wood in her arms. What troubles them now? There has been talk among the young women. They say you provided Sarah Jenkins with a remedy for an unwanted condition. Nizhoni's face remained impassive, though her grip on the firewood tightened. Sarah had come to her in tears, 17 and carrying the child of a man who had forced himself upon her. The man, the son of a councilman, had denied everything. I gave Sarah tea for her monthly pains, Nizhoni said carefully. Nothing more. The Reverend's thin lips pressed together. The council would prefer you not provide any remedies to our townspeople without proper Christian oversight. And who would provide this oversight? You, Reverend. Have you studied the properties of golden seal or yarrow? Can you distinguish between the mushroom that heals and the one that kills? A flush crept up the man's neck, visible even in the failing light. Pagan knowledge is not what saved Councilman Porter's wife when childbed fever took hold last spring. Nizhoni interrupted, a rare sharpness entering her voice. He is not what healed the infected wound on your own hand after you dismissed my offer of help 3 times. The Reverend unconsciously touched his left hand, where a scar remained from a deep cut that had festered until he'd finally accepted Nizhoni's poultice. The council merely wishes to remind you that your presence here is conditional upon your discretion. He straightened his back, adding height to his already imposing frame. These are godly people with godly concerns. Nizhoni looked past him toward Harrowfield, where families gathered around tables for evening meals, safe in their certainty of their own righteousness. Tell the council I understand their concerns, she said quietly. And I will continue to live as I have, harming none, helping those who ask, staying within the boundaries we agreed upon. Something shifted in the Reverend's gaze. Not softening, exactly, but a flicker of something that might have been respect. See that you do, he said finally. Winter makes people fearful, Miss Nizhoni. Fear makes them dangerous. As he turned to leave, the wind rose again, driving needles of ice before it. Nizhoni watched until his black-clad figure was swallowed by the swirling white. Fear makes them dangerous, she repeated to the empty air, but it also makes them blind. Inside her cabin, she added wood to the fire and hung her cloak to dry. As the flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, Nizhoni couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something beyond the storm that now shook the very foundations of her small home. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind's howling voice. It sounded almost like a child's cry. By nightfall, the storm had transformed from threat to fury. The wind no longer merely howled, it screamed, a banshee's wail that tore at the cabin's seams and found every crack in the sturdy logs. Nizhoni added more wood to her fire, watching as the flames leaped and danced, casting her shadow large against the wall. Outside, the world had vanished beneath a curtain of white so thick it seemed solid. Nizhoni moved to her table, where a small oil lamp illuminated her work. Her fingers deftly separated seeds from dried seed pods, each one carefully placed in a small deerskin pouch. These would be planted when the earth softened again, if spring ever returned to this frozen land. As she worked, she hummed softly, an ancient melody her mother had taught her before the smallpox came and took both her parents in the same merciless week. The earth remembers us by what we plant, her mother had said. Make sure it remembers you kindly. A particularly violent gust rattled the door, and Nizhoni glanced up, frowning. Even the wildest storms usually calmed somewhat after nightfall. but this one seemed to be gaining strength. She moved to the window, rubbing away the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass. Beyond, she could see nothing but swirling white, illuminated briefly by moonlight when the clouds parted for heartbeats at a time. Harrowfield would be suffering tonight. The settlers' homes, while sturdier than they had been in the early years, were not built with the knowledge of generations who had weathered these northern storms. They did not know how to angle their roofs just so, how to position their homes to deflect the worst of the wind. More than once, Nizhoni had tried to share this knowledge, only to be met with suspicious glares and muttered prayers. She returned to her seeds, but something kept drawing her attention back to the window. A feeling, not quite unease, but awareness, prickled at the back of her neck. Nizhoni had learned long ago to trust these feelings. Her grandmother had called it the knowing, the ability to sense when something was amiss in the natural order. Setting aside her work, she wrapped herself in her cloak again and moved to the door. She hesitated, hand on the latch. To step outside in such conditions was to court death. Yet the feeling persisted, tugging at her like an insistent child. When she opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Snow immediately invaded her cabin, swirling across the plank floor. Nizhoni squinted against the assault, pulling her hood tighter around her face. The cold was a living thing, biting at any exposed skin with vicious intent. She stood in the doorway, unsure of what she was seeking. Then, so faint it might have been imagination, a sound carried on the wind, a sound that did not belong to the storm. A cry, high and weak, then gone. Nizhoni strained to hear it again, her heart suddenly pounding. There again, definitely a cry and definitely human. A child's cry. Without further hesitation, she grabbed the torch she kept ready by the door, lit it from her fire, and stepped fully into the storm's embrace. The snow was already knee-deep and drifting higher. Each step was a battle, the wind attempting to push her back while the snow tried to trap her feet. "Hello," she called, her voice immediately swallowed by the storm's roar. "Is someone there?" The cry came again, somehow both clearer and more desperate. Nizhoni turned toward it, holding her torch high despite the wind's attempts to extinguish it. The flames guttered but held, casting a small circle of light in the engulfing darkness. She pushed forward, away from the safety of her cabin, following that pitiful sound. The path toward Harrowfield was completely obscured, but she knew these woods better than she knew her own face. Even in this whiteout, she could sense the trees around her, feel the slight decline of the land as it moved toward the settlement. The crying stopped. Nizhoni halted, turning in a slow circle, the torch held out before her. "Please," she called into the storm, "call out again. I'm here to help." Silence answered her. Had she imagined it after all? Was the storm playing tricks on her mind? Then she saw it, a dark shape against the snow, nearly covered by a fresh drift. Nizhoni rushed forward, falling to her knees beside what appeared to be a bundle of cloth. With her free hand, she brushed away the snow, a baby, tiny, red-faced and motionless. "No," Nizhoni breathed, setting the torch carefully in the snow and unwrapping the stiff outer layer of cloth. "No, little one." The infant couldn't be more than a few days old, its skin blue-tinged from cold. For a terrible moment, Nizhoni thought she was too late. Then the smallest of movements, the rise and fall of a breath so shallow it was barely perceptible, alive but barely. Nizhoni worked quickly, unwrapping her own cloak and creating a sling across her chest. She nestled the baby against her body, rewrapping the cloak tightly around them both. The infant was icy to the touch, its limbs stiff and unmoving. As she secured the child, a prickling sensation crawled up her spine. She was being watched. Slowly, Nizhoni retrieved her torch and raised it higher, illuminating more of the surrounding forest. Yellow eyes reflected the light, One pair, then another, then several more. Wolves. Drawn perhaps by the scent of the helpless infant, they had been circling, patient predators, waiting for the storm to do their work for them. The largest wolf took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the snow. Hunger had made it bold, willing to challenge the fire that animals usually feared. Nizhoni stood her ground, though fear coursed through her veins like ice water. She had no weapon save the torch. Against one wolf, perhaps she would stand a chance. Against a pack. The alpha wolf lowered its head, a growl rumbling from deep in its chest. The sound raised the hair on Nizhoni's arms. Death had come for the child, and now it had found her as well. But death would have to fight for its prize. Nizhoni raised her torch higher and shouted a word in her native tongue, a sound of power, passed down from healer to healer. The flame of her torch flared suddenly brighter, propelled by her will and the ancient word. The wolves hesitated, startled by the burst of light and sound. That moment of hesitation was all she needed. Nizhoni turned and ran, the baby clutched tightly to her chest, her feet somehow finding purchase in the treacherous snow. Behind her, she heard the wolves recover from their surprise, heard the soft sound of their pursuit. Her cabin was too far. She would never make it back in time. Instead, she angled toward a massive oak tree she knew well, one whose lower branches she could reach if the snow had drifted high enough beneath it. The wolves were gaining. She could feel their presence closing in, hear the rhythm of their breathing. The infant against her chest stirred slightly, perhaps responding to her racing heart. "Stay with me, little one," she gasped. "Stay with me." Through the curtain of snow, the great oak appeared, its branches weighed down with white. Nizhoni half ran, half stumbled toward it, her lungs burning from the exertion and the frigid air. She reached its base just as the lead wolf lunged. Nizhoni swung the torch in a wide arc, connecting with the wolf's shoulder. It yelped in pain and surprise, retreating momentarily. The others circled warily, respecting the fire but unwilling to abandon their hunt. With the wolves temporarily at bay, Nizhoni turned to the tree. The snow had indeed drifted high around its base, allowing her to reach the lowest branch. Still clutching the baby to her chest, she used her free arm to pull herself up, the torch gripped between her teeth. The bark was slick with ice, and her fingers, numb from cold, struggled to find purchase. Below, the wolves gathered, watching her escape with hungry, patient eyes. They would wait. They had time. But so did Nizhoni, and she had something the wolves did not, the fierce determination to protect the innocent life, now depending on her entirely. From her perch in the oak's embrace, Nizhoni looked down at the child in her arms. In the flickering torchlight, she could see the infant more clearly now, a boy, his features pinched with cold but perfect. Someone had wrapped him carefully before abandoning him to the storm and the wolves. Someone who perhaps thought they had no choice. "Who left you here, little one?" she whispered. "And why?" The wolves circled beneath the oak, their patience as endless as the falling snow. Nizhoni counted 7 of them, their lean bodies testifying to a hard winter with scarce prey. In their eyes, she and the infant represented survival. In another time, she might have respected their hunger, might have seen the balance in their need. But tonight, clutching the barely breathing child to her chest, she could afford no such understanding. The torch was burning low. Soon it would sputter out, and darkness would claim them. The wolves knew this too. She could see it in the way they settled on their haunches, conserving energy for the moment when the light failed. The baby stirred against her, making a soft sound that was barely a whimper. Such a fragile thing, this new life. Nizhoni shifted, cradling him closer to share what warmth her body could provide. She unwrapped part of her cloak to look at him again, so small, so perfect despite the blue tinge to his lips, the ice crystals forming on his sparse eyebrows. "Your mother must be half mad with grief," she whispered, though something told her this was not the case. No mother she knew would abandon her child to the elements, not willingly, unless Nizhoni had seen it before. The shame that came with certain births in the settler's world. Children born too soon after marriage, or to women with no husbands at all. Children whose fathers were not who they should be. The settlers had rigid beliefs about such things, beliefs that sometimes led to desperate acts. But speculation would not save them. Action would. Nizhoni examined her surroundings more carefully. The branch she sat upon was thick and relatively stable, but she could not remain here indefinitely. The cold would claim them both long before starvation became a concern. Her cabin was perhaps half a mile away, a distance that would be challenging but manageable in good weather. In this storm, with wolves in pursuit and a newborn to protect, it might as well have been 100 miles. She needed to think like her ancestors. What would they do, trapped in a tree with predators below and a child to save? The wolves had begun to grow restless, sensing perhaps that the torch would not last much longer. One of them, a younger male with a scar across his muzzle, pawed at the base of the tree, testing its bark with sharp claws. Nizhoni looked up through the branches. The storm still raged, but directly above her, the oak's dense canopy had created a small pocket of relative calm. The highest branches swayed violently, but here, closer to the trunk, the wind was somewhat blocked. More importantly, she could see that this tree's branches intertwined with those of a neighboring pine. An idea formed, a desperate one. But Nizhoni had no luxury of caution. Securing the infant more tightly against her body, she began to climb higher, moving carefully from branch to branch. The bark was slick with ice, and more than once her foot slipped, sending her heart into her throat. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that to remain stationary was to choose death. Below, the wolves grew agitated, sensing her movement. They began to circle more frantically, some leaping up against the trunk, claws scrabbling at the bark. Nizhoni reached the point where the oak's branches met those of the pine. Here, she would have to make a leap, not a large one, but treacherous given the ice-coated branches and her precious cargo. She paused, gathering her courage and calculating the distance. The torch chose that moment to sputter dramatically, the flame shrinking to a mere ember. The wolves below sensed the imminent darkness and began to howl, a chilling chorus that seemed to reverberate through the very wood of the tree. It was now or never. With a silent prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, Nizhoni extinguished what remained of the torch against the tree trunk, plunging herself into darkness save for the faint, diffused moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. Then, clutching the baby with both arms, she launched herself toward the neighboring pine. For a heart-stopping moment, she was airborne, the wind tearing at her cloak, the baby a warm weight against her chest. Then her body slammed into the pine's branches, needles scratching her face as she scrambled for purchase. Her feet found a branch, but it cracked under her weight. She slid, one hand clutching desperately at the trunk while the other protected the infant. Finally, her descent stopped. She had landed on a broader branch about halfway down the pine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The baby, miraculously, had not made a sound, though she could feel his tiny heart racing against hers. The wolves, confused by her disappearance from the oak, milled about between the two trees. They could smell her, but couldn't immediately locate her new position in the darkness. It wouldn't take them long, though. Nizhoni didn't wait. She began moving from branch to branch, descending the pine as quickly as she dared. This tree's branches were closer together, offering more points of support. When she reached the lowest branch, she paused, surveying the ground below. The wolves had begun to gather beneath the pine now, having tracked her scent. The alpha raised its head, yellow eyes seeming to lock with hers, even through the darkness. Nizhoni had one advantage left, the element of surprise. Unwinding a long strip of leather from around her waist, a belt she used to carry tools when gathering herbs, she secured the baby even more firmly to her chest, freeing both her hands. Then, drawing a deep breath, she dropped from the branch, landing in a deep snowdrift that cushioned her fall, but also buried her up to her waist. The wolves, startled by her sudden appearance, hesitated for a crucial moment. Nizhoni used that moment to extract herself from the snow and run, not back toward her cabin, but toward a narrow ravine she knew lay just beyond the pine. It was a gamble. The ravine might be completely filled with snow and impassable, or it might offer a path the wolves would find difficult to navigate. She could hear them behind her, their paws thudding on the packed snow, their breathing fast and hungry. The ravine appeared ahead, a dark slash in the white landscape. Without slowing, Nizhoni plunged into it, half sliding, half running down its steep bank. The descent was steeper than she remembered, or perhaps the snow had altered its contours. She lost her footing and tumbled, curling her body protectively around the infant as she rolled through the snow. Pain shot through her shoulder as it struck a hidden rock, but she bit back her cry. When she came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, Nizhoni immediately struggled to her feet, checking the baby. He was still breathing, still nestled securely against her. Above, she could see the wolves hesitating at the ravine's edge, wary of the steep descent, but they were hungry, and hunger made all creatures bold. One by one, they began to pick their way down, more cautiously than she had, but with determined purpose. Nizhoni turned and ran along the bottom of the ravine, following its winding path. The snow was shallower here, swept by the wind into drifts against the ravine walls rather than evenly distributed. This allowed her to move faster, though each breath was now a knife in her lungs, and the baby's weight seemed to grow heavier with every step. The ravine began to slope upward. Nizhoni knew it emerged not far from the edge of Harrowfield, close to where the Fosters had built their home 2 summers ago, if she could reach the settlement. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was futile. The settlers would not open their doors in the middle of a blizzard, especially not to her. Their fear of the forest and what they imagined lurked within it was too deeply ingrained. Her cabin was her only hope. And to reach it, she would need to leave the relative protection of the ravine and cross open ground where the wolves would have the advantage. The sound of pursuit had faded somewhat, but Nizhoni knew better than to believe the wolves had given up. They were conserving their strength, following at a distance, waiting for her to tire. As the ravine's walls began to lower, giving way to more level ground, Nizhoni paused to orient herself. The storm had disoriented her somewhat, but the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, her own hearth, still burning in her absence. Her heart leaped. The cabin was closer than she had dared hope. With renewed determination, she climbed out of the ravine and set off toward that promising scent. The snow was deep here, each step requiring significant effort. The baby had begun to stir more frequently, small whimpers escaping his blue lips. A good sign he was fighting, responding to the warmth of her body. "Just a little longer, little warrior," she murmured. "Soon you'll be warm. Soon you'll be safe." A howl split the night, closer than she expected. Turning, Nizhoni saw the wolves emerging from the ravine, their forms ghostly in the swirling snow. They had found her trail again. Her cabin appeared ahead, a dark shape against the whiteness, the golden glow of firelight visible through its single window, so close, so tantalizingly close. The lead wolf broke into a run. The others followed, a deadly wave of fur and fang flowing across the snow toward her. Nizhoni ran as she had never run before, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. The distance to her door seemed to stretch impossibly. 10 yards. 5. The wolves gaining with every stride. The alpha lunged, just as Nizhoni's hand closed around the door latch. She felt the brush of fur against her leg, the scrape of teeth catching her cloak. With a desperate cry, she threw herself forward, crashing through the door and slamming it shut behind her. Outside, the wolves hurled themselves against the sturdy logs, their howls of frustration rising above the storm's voice, but they could not break through. The cabin, built with the wisdom of generations, held firm. Inside, Nizhoni collapsed to her knees, trembling with exhaustion. The blessed warmth of the fire washed over her as she carefully unwrapped the infant from her cloak. His skin was still cool to the touch, his tiny hands and feet worryingly blue, but he lived. Against all odds, he lived. Nizhoni's hands moved with practiced urgency as she laid the infant on her bed, quickly building up the fire until the cabin filled with blessed warmth. Outside, the wolves continued their frustrated chorus, but their voices were growing more distant as they realized the futility of their hunt. The storm, however, showed no sign of abating. Its howl, a constant reminder that they were isolated, cut off from the world. The baby's breathing had grown more labored, each inhale a visible struggle that made his tiny chest rise and fall in an uneven rhythm. His skin remained frightfully blue, particularly around his lips and fingertips. Frostbite was setting in, a death sentence for one so small unless addressed immediately. "Stay with me," Nizhoni murmured, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You did not survive the wolves to be claimed by the cold." She worked methodically, drawing on knowledge passed through generations of healers. First, she heated water, testing its temperature carefully with her wrist until it was pleasantly warm, but not hot. Then she unwrapped the infant completely, her breath catching at the sight of his small, vulnerable body. He couldn't be more than 3 days old, his umbilical stump still fresh, his skin still bearing the wrinkled evidence of his time in the womb. Someone had dressed him in a simple linen gown, clean but unadorned, with none of the elaborate embroidery that usually marked a cherished firstborn. Around his neck hung a small wooden cross on a leather cord, a hasty blessing from someone who perhaps thought they were sending him to God's arms rather than the jaws of wolves. There was something else too, tucked into the folds of his swaddling cloth, a scrap of paper. Nizhoni set it aside carefully, her focus entirely on saving the child's life. She immersed the baby in the warm water, supporting his head with one hand, while the other gently massaged his limbs, encouraging blood to flow back into his extremities. The infant's eyes fluttered open briefly, deep blue, unfocused, before closing again. But that momentary awareness gave Nizhoni hope. "Good," she encouraged, though she knew he couldn't understand. "Fight, little one. Your spirit is stronger than you know." When the water began to cool, she lifted him out and dried him thoroughly with a soft cloth, wrapping him in a rabbit fur blanket she had made the previous autumn. The furs were baby soft, tanned using a method her grandmother had taught her, gentle enough for the most delicate skin. But warmth alone would not be enough. The infant's breathing remained shallow, and a worrying rattle had developed in his tiny chest. Pneumonia was setting in. The settlers called it winter fever, and it claimed countless lives each season, especially among the very young and very old. Nizhoni moved to the far corner of her cabin, where her most precious possessions were stored in a carved wooden chest. Inside lay the tools of her healing work, pouches of dried herbs, roots, berries, and barks, each collected at precisely the right moment of the year, each prepared with prayers and precise methods to preserve their power. She selected several bundles, Mullein leaves for the lungs, elderberry to fight the fever that would surely come, slippery elm bark to soothe and coat the throat. With deft movements, she prepared a thin broth, adding a pinch of maple sugar to make it palatable. When it had cooled to just above body temperature, she carefully dipped a clean cloth into the mixture and squeezed a few drops into the infant's mouth. The baby sputtered, then swallowed reflexively. Nizhoni nodded in satisfaction and continued, one drop at a time, patient and persistent. "Your mother should be doing this," she said softly. "Feeding you, warming you, singing to you." The thought of the infant's mother brought a frown to Nizhoni's face. She reached for the scrap of paper she had found in the swaddling clothes and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged by tears or snow. "His name is Samuel. May God forgive me." No signature, no explanation beyond those 7 words. Nizhoni studied the paper, turning it over to check the back, but there was nothing more, just a child, a name, and a plea for divine mercy. "Samuel," she said, testing the name on her tongue. The infant stirred slightly at the sound. "Is that who you are, little one? Samuel, who survived the wolves?" Outside, the storm's fury seemed to be lessening somewhat, the wind's howl softening to a steady moan. Dawn would come in a few hours, though the heavy clouds would likely obscure its arrival. Nizhoni knew she should rest while she could. The baby would need constant attention in the hours and days ahead. But as she prepared a small pallet beside her bed, a new sound joined the storm's voice, a sharp, insistent knocking at her door. Nizhoni froze, her hand instinctively moving to cover the infant. No one from Harrowfield would venture out in such weather, especially not to her cabin. The wolves had departed. She could no longer hear their hunting cries. Who, then, would be at her door in the dead of night during the worst blizzard in years? The knocking came again, more urgent this time. "Miss Nizhoni!" A woman's voice, high with panic. "Please, if you're there, I beg you." Nizhoni moved cautiously to the door, one hand on the knife she kept by the entrance. "Who calls?" she demanded. "Elizabeth Foster," came the reply, the words choked with tears. "Please, I need help." Nizhoni recognized the name immediately. Elizabeth and her husband Thomas had settled at the edge of Harrowfield 2 years ago. They kept to themselves mostly, but Thomas occasionally traded pelts with Nizhoni, one of the few settlers willing to engage in commerce with her directly rather than through intermediaries. She unlatched the door carefully, opening it just enough to see outside. Elizabeth stood on the threshold, snow coating her woolen cloak, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Blood stained the front of her dress, a concerning amount. "Come in," Nizhoni said, stepping back to allow the woman entry. "You're injured." Elizabeth stumbled inside, her legs seeming to give way beneath her. Nizhoni caught her before she could fall, guiding her to a chair near the fire. The woman's skin was clammy despite the cold, her eyes fever-bright. "Not injured," Elizabeth whispered. "The baby. My baby." Her words trailed off as her gaze fell upon the fur-wrapped bundle on Nizhoni's bed. For a moment, there was only silence broken by the crackling of the fire. Then Elizabeth let out a sound, half gasp, half sob, and lunged toward the infant. "Samuel! Oh God! My Samuel!" Nizhoni moved quickly, placing herself between the woman and the child. "Wait," she said firmly. "You left him in the snow to die." Elizabeth's face crumpled, fresh tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. No, I would never. Thomas, he..." The baby came early, you see, too early for... She swallowed hard. Thomas was away trading in Boston for most of the autumn. He returned just a month ago. He knows the child isn't his. The pieces fell into place in Nizhoni's mind. An unfaithful wife, a husband's rage, a newborn with no place in either world. Thomas took him, Elizabeth continued, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Said he would not raise another man's bastard. I begged, I pleaded. He said he was taking Samuel to the church in Lancaster, that perhaps they would find a family for him. But I knew he meant to... She couldn't finish the thought. So you followed him, Nizhoni guessed. Elizabeth nodded, wiping roughly at her tears. I waited until he left, then went after him. But the storm came so suddenly, and I lost his tracks. I've been searching for hours, going mad with fear. Then I saw your light and thought perhaps... Her gaze returned to the infant, hope and dread warring in her eyes. Is he? He lives, Nizhoni said simply. Though it was a near thing. The wolves found him before I did. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, horror dawning in her expression. Wolves! They did not touch him, Nizhoni assured her, but the cold has settled in his lungs. He needs careful tending. Fresh tears spilled from Elizabeth's eyes as she swayed in her seat. Now that Nizhoni looked more closely, she could see that the woman was in poor condition herself, likely still recovering from childbirth, exhausted from searching in the storm, and half frozen from exposure. You need rest, Nizhoni said, her tone gentler now, and warm food. You can do nothing for your son if you collapse. Elizabeth shook her head stubbornly. I need to hold him. Please. After a moment's hesitation, Nizhoni relented, carefully lifting the sleeping infant and placing him in his mother's trembling arms. Elizabeth's entire body seemed to soften as she cradled her child, her tears falling onto his small face. Samuel, she whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead. My Samuel. I'm so sorry. Nizhoni busied herself preparing a simple broth, adding herbs to strengthen the blood Elizabeth had clearly lost during or after childbirth. As she worked, she glanced occasionally at the mother and child by her fire, a tableau of love and desperation that stirred something deep within her chest. What will you do now? She asked finally, passing Elizabeth a steaming mug. Your husband is not my husband anymore, Elizabeth said with sudden steel in her voice. Not after this. I'll take Samuel and go east to my sister in Salem. She'll help us. Salem is more than 50 miles away, Nizhoni pointed out, and the winter has only just begun. You cannot travel with a newborn in these conditions. Elizabeth's shoulders slumped as the reality of her situation settled over her. Then where? Thomas will come looking once the storm passes. He'll be furious when he realizes I've gone after Samuel. Nizhoni considered the woman before her a settler, one of those who viewed Nizhoni's people with suspicion at best and hatred at worst. Yet here she sat, trusting Nizhoni with her life and that of her child. The world was strange indeed. You can remain here, she heard herself say, until the baby is stronger. Until you both are stronger. Elizabeth looked up, surprise clear on her exhausted face. You would do that for us. Nizhoni moved to the fire, adding another log. I did not save your son from wolves and winter only to send him back into danger, she said simply. Rest now. We will speak more when the storm has passed. As if in agreement, the infant made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a definite sign of life. Elizabeth's face transformed, momentary joy breaking through the worry and fear. Nizhoni watched them silently, something tugging at her heart. She had delivered many babies among her own people, had helped countless mothers through the perils of childbirth, but she had never had a child of her own. The Great Spirit had not chosen that path for her. Yet as the night deepened around the small cabin, as the storm gradually eased its assault, Nizhoni felt a curious sense of rightness. This strange night, with its dangers and its miracles, had brought these two lost souls to her door. Perhaps this too was the work of the Great Spirit. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, barely visible through the falling snow. A new day approached, bringing with it unknown challenges, but also, perhaps, unexpected blessings. The storm departed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Harrowfield lay half-buried, chimneys poking through drifts that reached windows, paths between homes carved like tunnels through white walls. The morning sun sparkled across the pristine expanse, so bright it hurt the eyes, a deceptive beauty that masked the deadly cold still gripping the land. 3 days had passed since Nizhoni had rescued Samuel from the wolves. 3 days of constant vigilance, of herbal remedies administered by the spoonful, of warming stones by the fire and placing them near the infant's swaddled form to chase away the chill that seemed lodged in his very bones. 3 days of Elizabeth barely leaving her child's side, her own recovery secondary to her fierce determination to see her son live. And against considerable odds, Samuel was improving. The worrisome rattle in his chest had subsided, replaced by stronger, clearer breaths. His skin had lost the bluish tinge, flushing pink with returning health. Most remarkably, his eyes, when they opened, seemed to focus with unexpected clarity for one so young. He sees me, Elizabeth whispered that third morning, wonder softening her drawn features as Samuel's gaze locked with hers. Truly sees me. Nizhoni, grinding dried elderberries into powder at her table, smiled slightly. Of course he does. He knows his mother. Elizabeth's face clouded. I abandoned him. No, Nizhoni said firmly, setting aside her work. Your husband took him. You searched through a blizzard to find him. Nearly killed yourself doing so. She crossed to where Elizabeth sat, placing a hand briefly on the woman's shoulder, an unexpected gesture that surprised them both. That is not abandonment. That is love. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, but she blinked them away, clearly unwilling to give in to the emotions still raw within her. Instead, she changed the subject. The medicine you've been giving him, what is it? I've never seen a child recover so quickly from winter fever. Elderberry for the fever and to strengthen his spirit, mullein for his lungs, willow bark to ease pain. Nizhoni returned to her work, her practiced hands never pausing, and prayers to the Great Spirit asking that this small life be spared. Elizabeth's expression flickered. Prayers, not to God. To the one who made all things, Nizhoni replied evenly. The name matters less than the intent. Elizabeth fell silent, clearly uncomfortable with this perspective, but unwilling to challenge the woman who had saved her son's life. After a moment, she asked, Will we be able to leave soon? Once Samuel is stronger? Nizhoni considered the question. The roads would be impassable for at least a week, perhaps longer. Even then, traveling with a newborn in the dead of winter would be perilous. But she understood the woman's anxiety. Thomas Foster would not simply accept the disappearance of his wife and the child he had tried to dispose of. Perhaps in a week, she said finally. If Samuel continues to improve, and if you regain your strength as well. She eyed the pale woman critically. You lost much blood in childbirth. Your body needs time to heal? Elizabeth nodded reluctantly, glancing toward the door, as if expecting her husband to burst through it at any moment. Her fear was a tangible thing, like a third presence in the small cabin. He will not find you easily, Nizhoni assured her, reading her thoughts. The snow has covered all tracks, and few in Harrowfield know of my cabin's exact location. Even as she spoke the words, however, Nizhoni felt a flicker of unease. Thomas Foster was one of those few who did know where she lived. If he had returned from his grim errand and discovered his wife missing, how long before he connected the pieces? Her concern proved prophetic. As midday approached, bringing with it a softening of the brutal cold, the sound of voices carried through the crisp air, men's voices approaching from the direction of the settlement. Elizabeth heard them too. She clutched Samuel to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "It's Thomas," she whispered. "He's come for us." Nizhoni moved swiftly to the window, peering through the glass that remained clouded with frost at its edges. A group of men was indeed approaching, 5 of them, trudging through the deep snow with determined strides. Thomas Foster led them, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him came the Reverend Hayes, his black coat stark against the whiteness, and 3 others Nizhoni recognized as members of the town council. "Take Samuel to the back room," Nizhoni instructed, her voice calm despite the tightening in her chest. "Stay quiet." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before obeying, disappearing behind the deerskin curtain that separated Nizhoni's sleeping area from the main room. Nizhoni quickly cleared away any evidence of the infant's presence. The small bowl she had used to feed him, the extra blankets by the fire. Then she took a deep breath and opened the door before the men could knock. "Good day, gentlemen," she said, blocking the entrance with her body. "What brings the town council to my door?" Thomas Foster stepped forward, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes hard as flint. "Where is she?" he demanded without preamble. "Where is my wife?" Nizhoni regarded him steadily. "I do not know who you mean, Mr. Foster. Do not play games with me, witch," he spat. "Elizabeth left our home 3 nights ago, during the worst of the storm. She's not in the settlement." "She must have come here." The Reverend placed a restraining hand on Foster's arm. "Peace, Thomas," he murmured, then addressed Nizhoni with forced civility. "Miss Nizhoni, we have reason to believe that Elizabeth Foster may have sought shelter with you during the blizzard. Her absence has caused considerable concern in the community, as has the absence of her newborn child," added Councilman Porter, a heavy-set man with jowls that quivered with barely suppressed disapproval. "Thomas tells us the infant was stillborn, yet Elizabeth insists otherwise. She has been unwell in her mind since the delivery." Nizhoni's expression betrayed nothing, though anger kindled in her breast at their easy lies. "I have not seen Elizabeth Foster," she said, which was technically true. She had not seen the woman until after she had rescued Samuel. Thomas's face darkened. "You're lying. Let us search your home." "No!" Nizhoni's refusal was immediate and firm. "My home is my own. You have no right to enter it uninvited." "We have every right," countered Councilman Winters, the oldest of the group. "And if you are harboring a disturbed woman and an infant that rightfully belongs to its father, an infant you left to die in the snow," Nizhoni cut in, her patience fraying. "An infant the wolves nearly claimed." A shocked silence fell over the group. Thomas's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. "What did you say?" "You heard me well enough." Nizhoni's voice was steel. "You abandoned your wife's newborn son in the forest during a blizzard. You left him for the wolves and the cold. That is not the action of a father. That is the action of a murderer." The Reverend's eyes widened. "These are serious accusations, Miss Nizhoni. Do you have proof of such claims?" Before Nizhoni could respond, a thin cry rose from the back of the cabin. Samuel, awake and hungry. The men's heads turned toward the sound as one. Thomas lunged forward, attempting to push past Nizhoni into the cabin. She stood her ground, stronger than her slight frame suggested. "You will not enter," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You will not touch that child again." "That is my son," Thomas roared, though all present knew the claim was a lie. "A son you tried to kill," came Elizabeth's voice as she emerged from behind the curtain. Samuel clutched protectively to her chest. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes meeting her husband's without flinching. "A son you left to die alone in the cold because your pride couldn't bear that he wasn't of your blood." The reverend and councilman shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this direct confrontation. Thomas, however, only grew more enraged. "You adulterous whore," he hissed. "You think these men will take your word over mine? A woman who spread her legs for another man while her husband was away." "Thomas," the reverend admonished, though his tone lacked conviction, "such language is unseemly." "What is unseemly?" Elizabeth retorted, her voice shaking but clear, "is a man who would murder an innocent child to salve his wounded pride. Nizhoni saved my son's life. She fought wolves and winter to bring him to safety when his own father," her voice caught, "when the man who should have protected him left him to die." A tense silence followed her words. The councilmen exchanged glances, clearly uncertain where the truth lay in this domestic dispute. The reverend's gaze moved from Thomas to Elizabeth, then settled on the infant in her arms. "The child seems remarkably well," he observed, his tone careful. "Until you say he was left in the snow during the blizzard." Nizhoni nodded. "For how long, I cannot say, but when I found him, he was nearly frozen. The wolves had already caught his scent." "Yet he lives," Councilman Porter said slowly, not even a touch of frostbite on his face. His eyes narrowed as they moved from the infant to Nizhoni. "Most unusual for a newborn exposed to such conditions. A miracle," Elizabeth said fervently. "Our God guided Nizhoni to him before it was too late," but Nizhoni caught something in Porter's expression that sent a chill down her spine, not acceptance, but suspicion, a calculating look that boded ill. "Indeed," the Reverend said, his voice neutral, "it seems God's hand was at work that night." But his eyes, too, held a shadow of doubt as they lingered on Nizhoni. Thomas sensed the shift in the men's attention and seized the opportunity. "Or perhaps," he suggested, his voice dropping to an insinuating murmur, "it was not God's hand at all, but something else entirely." He turned to the councilman. "Have you not all heard the rumors, the strange brews this woman concocts, the charms she sells to the weak-minded, the spells she casts in the forest under the full moon?" "I am a healer," Nizhoni said firmly. "Nothing more. A healer who practices arts unknown to Christian medicine," Thomas pressed. "A healer whose patients recover when they should not. A healer who somehow found a nearly frozen infant in the middle of the worst blizzard in a decade and restored him to perfect health in mere days." He leaned closer to Reverend Hayes. "Are these the works of God, Reverend, or of something darker?" The seed was planted. Nizhoni could see it taking root in the men's expressions, that age-old fear of what they did not understand, what they could not control, the fear that had driven her people from their ancestral lands, that had kindled countless fires beneath innocent women across New England. "I think," the Reverend said carefully, "that we should return to Harrowfield and discuss this matter further. The council will need to determine the proper course of action. You cannot take the child," Nizhoni said firmly, "nor Elizabeth, if she wishes to remain. For now," Councilman Winters conceded reluctantly, "the infant and mother may stay here, as the child appears too fragile to be moved safely." He fixed Nizhoni with a stern gaze. "But know this, we will be watching. And we will return." As the men turned to leave, Thomas Foster cast one last venomous glance at his wife. "This isn't finished," he promised, his voice low enough that only Nizhoni and Elizabeth could hear, not by a long measure. Nizhoni waited until the men had disappeared down the path toward Harrowfield before closing the door. Elizabeth sank onto a chair, her legs seemingly unable to support her any longer. "They'll come back," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Samuel closer. "They'll take him from me. They'll—" "Hush!" Nizhoni interrupted, moving to stoke the fire. "They will try, perhaps, but they will not succeed." "You don't understand," Elizabeth insisted. "When Thomas sets his mind to something, and now he's put ideas in their heads about you, about witchcraft. I understand better than you know," Nizhoni replied, her voice steady despite the cold fear taking root in her own heart. "I have seen what fear and ignorance can do. I have watched my people driven from their homes, killed for simply existing on land others coveted." She turned to face Elizabeth, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. But I have also seen courage overcome fear, truth defeat lies. We are not without resources, Elizabeth Foster, and we are not without allies." Elizabeth looked doubtful, but Samuel chose that moment to let out a small, insistent cry. The ordinary hunger of a healthy infant, a sound so normal it cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Elizabeth's face softened as she adjusted her clothing to feed him. Nizhoni watched them for a moment, then moved to the window, gazing out at the brilliant white landscape. The men's tracks were already beginning to fill with new snow that had started falling, gentle flakes, unlike the driving fury of the blizzard. Her thoughts turned to the women of Harrowfield, those who had come to her in secret for remedies and advice, those whose children and husbands she had healed when conventional medicine failed. Would they stand with her if accusations of witchcraft were formalized? Or would they, too, turn their faces away, deny their connections to her, perhaps even join in the chorus of condemnation to protect themselves? The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but as Nizhoni watched the snow continue to fall, covering the men's footprints as if they had never been, she felt a quiet determination settle in her bones. She had not survived the loss of her family, the displacement of her people, and the suspicion of the settlers only to be defeated now. Samuel's life had been placed in her hands by forces beyond understanding. She would not fail him or his mother, no matter what storms might yet come. In Harrowfield, whispers traveled faster than winter winds. By sundown, every household had heard some version of the confrontation at Nizhoni's cabin. The story morphed with each telling, details embellished, suspicions magnified. What began as a domestic dispute between Thomas and Elizabeth Foster transformed into something far more sinister in the minds of those who had always viewed Nizhoni with unease. "She cast a spell on Elizabeth," murmured the miller's wife to the blacksmith's daughter as they collected water from the town well. "Lured her away from her rightful husband. The child should have died in that storm," declared Goodman Hughes, warming his hands by the tavern fire. "No infant could survive a night in such cold, exposed to the elements. It ain't natural." "My cousin in Salem told me how it starts," whispered Widow Perkins, her thin fingers working nervously at her knitting. "First they heal when they shouldn't. Then the livestock falls ill. Then the children—" Fear fed on itself, growing fat on ignorance and superstition. Those few who had benefited from Nizhoni's healing skills remained conspicuously silent, afraid that any defense of her would cast suspicion on themselves. Only Hannah Thatcher, the midwife, dared speak openly in her defense. "Nonsense and foolishness," she declared when the rumors reached her ears. "I've known Nizhoni for 5 years. She saved more lives with her remedies than prayer ever did." But Hannah's voice was a lone reed bending against a strengthening wind. In her snug cabin, blissfully unaware of the growing storm of accusations, Nizhoni continued to care for Samuel and Elizabeth. The infant thrived under her attention, his cheeks filling out, his cries growing stronger by the day. Elizabeth, too, regained her strength gradually, the shadows beneath her eyes receding as she slept without fear for the first time in months. A strange domesticity had developed between the two women, so different in background, yet united by their shared protection of Samuel. Elizabeth learned to grind herbs with the stone mortar to recognize the plants Nizhoni had dried and stored for winter remedies. Nizhoni, in turn, listened to Elizabeth's stories of her childhood in Boston, her dreams of education that had withered when her father arranged her marriage to Thomas. "I could read before most boys my age," Elizabeth confided one evening as they sat by the fire, Samuel sleeping peacefully in a cradle Nizhoni had fashioned from woven reeds. "My mother taught me secretly, against my father's wishes. He said too much learning made women dissatisfied with their proper place. Your father and the men of your society fear what they cannot control," Nizhoni replied, her fingers working deftly to twist fibers into cord. "In my tribe, women are the keepers of wisdom. They decide when to plant, when to harvest, which marriages would bring strength to the community." Elizabeth looked thoughtful. "And yet your people were driven away, despite this wisdom." "Wisdom cannot stop bullets," Nizhoni said simply, "or sickness brought deliberately in trading blankets, or the theft of land through papers our elders could not read." She paused, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "But wisdom can teach us to survive, to adapt, to find new paths when old ones are blocked." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by an urgent knocking. Both women tensed, Elizabeth instinctively moving to stand between the door and Samuel's cradle. Nizhoni rose cautiously, one hand slipping into the pocket of her dress where she kept a small knife. "Who comes?" she called. "Hannah Thatcher," came the reply. "Quickly, Nizhoni!" Recognizing the midwife's voice, Nizhoni unlatched the door. Hannah entered in a flurry of cold air and snowflakes, her usually calm demeanor visibly shaken. She nodded briefly to Elizabeth before turning her attention to Nizhoni. "You must leave," she said without preamble. "Both of you, with the child, tonight." "What has happened?" Nizhoni asked, though the dread in her stomach told her she already knew. Hannah removed her snow-covered cloak, her movements agitated. "The council met this afternoon. Thomas Foster has convinced them that his wife is under some enchantment, that you bewitched her to steal away with her child." She glanced at Elizabeth apologetically. "They're saying you're not in your right mind. That grief over a stillborn child has made you susceptible to the Indian woman's influence." Elizabeth's face drained of color. "But that's absurd. Samuel is right here, alive and well." "That's part of the problem," Hannah said grimly. "Thomas has told everyone the baby died during birth. He even showed the Reverend a small grave he dug behind your house. So this child," she gestured toward the sleeping infant, her expression troubled. "They're saying he's not the same child, that he's a changeling conjured by witchcraft." Nizhoni felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter night. "And they believed this tale?" "People believe what calms their fears," Hannah replied. "It's easier to blame witchcraft than to accept that a man they've broken bread with would leave his own child to die in the snow." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Reverend Hayes has sent for Magistrate Collins from Lancaster. He'll be here within a fortnight, weather permitting. They mean to hold a formal inquiry." "An inquiry?" Elizabeth echoed, her voice rising in panic. "You mean a witch trial?" Hannah nodded grimly. "They're gathering testimonies even now. Every unexplained illness, every stillborn calf, every spoiled batch of beer. Suddenly they're all being laid at Nizhoni's door." She turned to the healer, her eyes pleading. "You know what happened in Salem. You know how these accusations spread, how they consume everything in their path." Nizhoni remained still, her face unreadable as she absorbed this news. Finally, she asked, Why are you warning us, Hannah? You risk much by coming here." The midwife straightened her shoulders. "Because I haven't forgotten who saved my grandson when the fever took hold last winter. Because I've seen your remedies work when my own failed." Her voice cracked slightly. "And because I've seen what happens when fear overtakes reason. I won't have that blood on my hands again." The word "again" hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken history. "How long do we have?" Nizhoni asked. "They plan to come for you at first light," Hannah replied. "A party of men led by Thomas and the constable. They'll bring you both back to the meeting house for questioning until the magistrate arrives." She hesitated. "And they'll take the child into the Reverend's care." Elizabeth let out a small, broken sound, moving to the cradle where Samuel still slept, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding him. "Where can we go?" she whispered. "It's the dead of winter, and I have a newborn." Nizhoni's mind raced, weighing options, calculating risks. To flee with an infant in these conditions would be perilous. To stay meant certain disaster. There had to be another path, another way. "I might know a place," Hannah said carefully. "My sister's husband has a cabin, half a day's journey north. They use it for hunting in autumn, but it stands empty now. It's small, but it would shelter you while we decide what to do next." Nizhoni crossed to the window, peering out at the night. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon cast a pale light over the crystalline landscape. Conditions for travel were as good as they could hope for in January. "We leave within the hour," she decided. "Pack only what we can easily carry. Food, warm clothing, medicines for Samuel." She turned to Hannah, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for the risk you've taken. We will not forget it." As they hastily gathered essentials, Nizhoni felt the weight of what they were leaving behind. Her home, built with her own hands, her garden, dormant beneath the snow but filled with plants she had tended for years, the sense of place and belonging she had carved out for herself despite the settlers' suspicions. Yet looking at Elizabeth gently wrapping Samuel in layers of fur and wool, Nizhoni knew she would sacrifice all of it without hesitation. Some bonds transcended the material, some purposes outweighed personal loss. Her grandmother had taught her that the true measure of a healer was not in the remedies she created, but in the lives she chose to protect. And she had made her choice. The moon hung like a silver medallion in the black velvet sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Nizhoni led the way, her footsteps deliberate and sure, finding the path that would be least taxing for Elizabeth, who followed several paces behind. Samuel was secured to his mother's chest with a length of cloth wrapped in the Abenaki fashion, his small body protected from the cold by layers of rabbit fur and wool. So far, he had remained blessedly quiet, soothed perhaps by the rhythm of his mother's heartbeat and the gentle motion of her walking. They had left Nizhoni's cabin an hour after Hannah's warning, slipping away under cover of darkness. The midwife had provided them with rough directions to her brother-in-law's hunting cabin. Follow the frozen creek north until it forked, then take the eastern branch until they reached a stand of 3 massive pines that had survived the settlers. Axes. The cabin lay just beyond, nestled against a rocky outcropping that would shield it from the worst of the winter winds. The snow crunched beneath their feet, each step leaving evidence of their passage that would be clear to any tracker come morning. But Nizhoni had been raised to outsmart hunters. She led them through shallow streams where possible, the ice crackling beneath their weight but holding firm. She guided them under low-hanging pine boughs, where their tracks would be partially obscured by fallen needles. Every precaution taken to confuse those who would certainly come looking when they found her cabin empty. "We must rest," Elizabeth gasped after they had traveled for nearly 2 hours. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her breath coming in labored clouds. Just for a moment, Nizhoni hesitated, weighing the risk of delay against Elizabeth's clear exhaustion. The woman was still recovering from childbirth, her body not yet restored to its full strength. Pushing her too hard might cause a collapse that would doom them all. Briefly, she conceded, guiding Elizabeth to a fallen log that offered a makeshift seat. "Drink this." She handed over a small skin containing a tea she had brewed before their departure, raspberry leaf to strengthen the blood, with a touch of willow bark for energy. Elizabeth drank gratefully, then adjusted Samuel's wrappings to check on him. The infant's eyes were closed, his breathing steady. "He sleeps through anything," she murmured with quiet wonder. "Just like his." She stopped abruptly, pain flickering across her features. "Like his father," Nizhoni guessed gently. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes fixed on Samuel's peaceful face. John. His name was John Winthrop. A scholar from Boston who came to document the flora of the region. A sad smile touched her lips. "He showed me plants I'd walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing. Taught me their Latin names, their properties. He treated me as if my mind mattered." Nizhoni understood more than Elizabeth might have guessed. The hunger for recognition, for being seen as more than one's designated role. It was a familiar ache. "What happened to him?" she asked. "He returned to Boston when summer ended." Elizabeth's voice grew flat. "He didn't know about Samuel. Perhaps he still doesn't." She stroked the infant's cheek with a gloved finger. "Perhaps it's better that way." Before Nizhoni could respond, a distant sound froze her blood, the baying of hounds. She rose swiftly, scanning the darkness behind them. Nothing visible yet, but the sound carried clearly in the still winter air. "We've been discovered sooner than I expected," she said tersely. "We must move. Now." Fear gave Elizabeth new strength. She stood quickly, wincing slightly but offering no complaint. How far to the cabin? At least another hour's journey. Nizhoni's mind raced. The dogs would follow their scent unerringly, leading the men straight to them. They needed to alter their course, create a diversion. An idea formed. "This way," she directed, veering away from their original path and toward a dense thicket of scrub oak and juniper. She rummaged in her pack as they walked, retrieving a small pouch of dried herbs. "What is that?" Elizabeth asked, watching as Nizhoni sprinkled the mixture in their tracks. "Anise and mint with a touch of foxglove," Nizhoni explained. "It will confuse the dog's sense of smell, perhaps long enough for us to reach safety." The dogs' baying grew more distant as they changed direction, but Nizhoni harbored no illusions that they had lost their pursuers. Thomas Foster would not give up so easily, especially now that his pride was wounded before the entire town. A man like that, whose sense of self was built entirely on the respect of other men, would pursue them to the ends of the earth rather than admit defeat. They pushed on through the night, the temperature dropping steadily until the cold felt like a physical presence pressing against them. Elizabeth stumbled more frequently, her strength clearly flagging despite her determination. Samuel had begun to fuss, small whimpering sounds that threatened to become full-throated cries. "He needs to be fed," Elizabeth said, her voice edged with desperation. "And I can't. Not while walking like this." Nizhoni scanned their surroundings. They had reached the fork in the creek Hannah had described, which meant they were closer to the cabin than she had dared hope. But the dogs' baying had grown louder again. The hunters had corrected their course and were gaining ground. "There," she decided, pointing to a small hollow beneath a fallen tree where the snow had not penetrated. "It will shield you from the wind. I'll keep watch." Elizabeth sank gratefully into the relative shelter, unfastening her cloak enough to put Samuel to her breast. The infant latched immediately, his tiny hands flexing with relief. Nizhoni stood a few paces away, her back to them to provide privacy, her eyes scanning the moonlit forest for any sign of movement. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by Samuel's soft nursing sounds. Then, carried on the night air, came the unmistakable murmur of men's voices. Too close, far too close. "They're coming," Nizhoni whispered urgently. "We must—" The words died in her throat as a twig snapped nearby. She whirled toward the sound, instinctively placing herself between Elizabeth and the potential threat. A figure emerged from the shadows. Not one of the men from Harrowfield, but an Abenaki hunter, bow in hand, surprise evident on his weathered face as he took in the scene before him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. "Nizhoni," the man said finally, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "Askuk," she replied, relief flooding through her as she identified one of her father's old hunting companions. "Brother of my father's heart." The hunter's eyes moved from Nizhoni to Elizabeth, who was hastily rewrapping Samuel, fear plain on her face. His expression remained unreadable. "You run from the white men," he said, not a question. Nizhoni nodded. "They hunt us like deer. The woman and her child will die if they are caught." Askuk's gaze lingered on Elizabeth and Samuel. In the complicated history between their peoples, white women and children had often been taken captive during raids. Bargaining pieces in the brutal chess game of colonial conflict, Nizhoni could read the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of old grievances against present circumstances. "She is under my protection," Nizhoni said firmly. As is her son." Something shifted in Askuk's expression, respect, perhaps, for the steel in her voice. He gestured toward the northeast. "There are 3 white men with dogs coming this way. 2 more circle around the creek's bend." He pointed in the opposite direction. 5 more approach from the south. Nizhoni's heart sank. They were being surrounded, the net closing in from all sides. "We seek the white hunter's cabin near the 3 tall pines," she explained quickly. "Can we reach it without being seen?" Askuk considered, then gave a short nod. "Follow. Stay close." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he melted back into the shadows. Nizhoni helped Elizabeth to her feet, and they hurried after him, following the silent hunter through the dense underbrush where no trail was visible to untrained eyes. Askuk moved like a spirit through the forest, his footfalls making no sound on the crusted snow, his body finding gaps in the vegetation that Nizhoni would have missed entirely. They could still hear the dogs, but the sound remained at a constant distance, neither growing closer nor fading away. Askuk led them across a frozen stream, then up a steep incline where the going was treacherous. Elizabeth struggled, her strength nearly spent, but fear for her child drove her forward. Samuel, disturbed by the increased pace, began to cry in earnest, the sound carrying alarmingly in the night air. Askuk stopped abruptly, turning to face them with concern etched on his features. "The child's cries will lead them to us. He's cold and frightened," Elizabeth said defensively, trying to soothe Samuel by rocking him gently. "I can't make him stop." Nizhoni reached into her pouch and withdrew a small piece of maple sugar. "Place a tiny amount on his tongue," she instructed. "Just enough to distract him." Elizabeth complied, and the sweetness had the desired effect. Samuel's cries subsided to hiccuping whimpers, then to silence as the sugar dissolved on his tongue. They pressed on, each step a battle against exhaustion and the bitter cold that seemed to leach the very life from their limbs. Askuk remained a few paces ahead, occasionally pausing to listen or to examine some sign invisible to his companions. Finally, After what seemed an eternity, he stopped at the crest of a small rise and pointed. "There," he said simply. Below them stood 3 towering white pines, their massive trunks rising like columns against the night sky, and nestled just beyond, barely visible through the trees, was the outline of a small cabin. No smoke rose from its chimney, no light shone from its single window. It appeared abandoned, forgotten by time. Relief washed over Nizhoni, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. "Thank you, Askuk," she said, the words inadequate for the debt they owed him. "We would not have found it without your help." The hunter's face remained impassive, but something like warmth flickered in his dark eyes. "The spirits of our ancestors guided me to you tonight. I do not question their wisdom." He glanced toward the south, where the distant sound of the search party could still be heard. "I will lead them away from here. The dogs will follow my trail." "It's too dangerous," Nizhoni protested. "If they catch you, they will not catch me," Askuk said with quiet confidence. "I hunted these forests before their grandfathers were born." He placed a hand briefly on Nizhoni's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of shared blood and history. Then he reached into his pouch and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. "Take this." For protection, Nizhoni looked down at a small carving of a wolf, crafted from dark soapstone, worn smooth by years of handling. "I cannot accept this. It was your father's. And now it is yours," Askuk replied firmly. "May it guard you as it guarded him." He glanced at Elizabeth, who stood swaying with exhaustion. Samuel clutched to her chest. "The white woman has courage. Perhaps her son will grow to walk in balance between worlds." With that cryptic statement, he turned and disappeared into the forest, deliberately making more noise than necessary, ensuring the dogs would pick up his trail. Nizhoni watched him go, the stone wolf warm in her palm despite the frigid air. Then she turned to Elizabeth. "Come, we're almost there." They made their way carefully down the slope toward the cabin. As they drew closer, Nizhoni saw that it was indeed abandoned, but solidly built, a hunter's refuge with thick log walls and a stone chimney. The door was secured with a simple wooden latch that yielded to her touch. Inside, the air was musty, but no colder than outdoors. A rough table, 2 stools, and a narrow cot were the only furnishings. A small fireplace dominated one wall, filled with cold ashes, but with a stack of split logs piled neatly beside it. Hannah's brother-in-law had prepared the cabin for winter disuse, but left it ready for emergency shelter. Elizabeth sank onto the cot, her strength finally deserting her. Samuel, sensing the cessation of movement, began to fuss again, his small face screwed up with displeasure. "Rest," Nizhoni told her, taking Samuel from her arms. "I'll build a fire and warm some water." Working efficiently despite her own exhaustion, Nizhoni soon had a fire crackling in the hearth, its golden light transforming the stark cabin into something approaching comfort. She melted snow in a small pot she found, hanging by the fireplace, adding a pinch of dried mint to freshen the water. Samuel, calmed by the warmth and the rhythmic sound of Nizhoni humming an Abenaki lullaby, dozed in the crook of her arm while she worked. Elizabeth watched through half-closed eyes, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "Why did you help us? You could have turned us away when I came to your door. You could have given Samuel to Thomas to save yourself." A tear slipped down her cheek. "No one would have blamed you." Nizhoni considered the sleeping infant in her arms, his perfect features relaxed in slumber, his tiny hand curled around her finger with surprising strength. How to explain the bond she had felt from the moment she'd found him in the snow? how to articulate the fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with a soul-deep recognition. "And in my tradition," she said slowly, "a child belongs not only to its parents but to the entire community. Each adult bears responsibility for each child, regardless of whose body gave it life." She met Elizabeth's gaze steadily. "I found Samuel in the snow. I carried him through the wolves' hunting ground. I warmed his body when cold nearly claimed him. These actions created a bond that cannot be broken by men's laws or church doctrines." Elizabeth nodded, understanding dawning in her tired eyes. "In your eyes, he's as much your child as mine." "He is your son," Nizhoni corrected gently. "But yes, our lives are now connected in ways that go beyond simple circumstance." She glanced toward the window, where the first faint lightening of the eastern sky hinted at approaching dawn. "Sleep now. We're safe for the moment." As Elizabeth drifted into exhausted slumber, Nizhoni settled by the fire with Samuel still nestled against her, the stone wolf carving clutched in her free hand. She could hear the distant baying of the dogs, but the sound was moving away, following Askuk's false trail. They had escaped immediate danger, but she harbored no illusions about their situation. Thomas Foster would not give up his pursuit. The accusations of witchcraft would not simply vanish, and two women with an infant could not survive indefinitely in a hunter's cabin in the dead of winter. They needed a more permanent solution, a place of true safety where Samuel could grow without the shadow of suspicion or the taint of his mother's supposed sin. Such places were rare in a world increasingly divided by faith, heritage, and the artificial boundaries men drew upon the land. But as she gazed down at Samuel's sleeping face, Nizhoni felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Hope. Perhaps this child, born between worlds, protected by two women from different traditions, carried within him the seed of a different future, one where understanding might someday replace fear, where wisdom might finally overcome ignorance. It was, she decided, a future worth fighting for. 3 days passed in the hunter's cabin, 3 days of watchful waiting and tentative recovery. The winter sun traced its low arc across the sky, offering light but little warmth. Inside the small shelter, Nizhoni maintained a careful fire, never allowing it to grow large enough for the smoke to be visible from a distance, yet sufficient to keep the bitter cold at bay. Samuel thrived despite their circumstances, his cheeks growing fuller, his eyes more alert and curious about the shadowed world that surrounded him. Elizabeth's strength returned gradually. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nizhoni found her standing by the cabin's single window, gazing out at the pristine whiteness, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the frost-covered glass. "What will become of us?" she asked without turning, her voice soft but no longer edged with the desperation of their flight. "We cannot remain here forever." Nizhoni paused in her task of grinding dried berries into a fine powder for Samuel's medicine. "No," she agreed. "Oh, the hunting cabin will suffice until the immediate danger passes, but we must find a more permanent sanctuary before spring." "And where might that be?" Elizabeth turned, her features composed, but her eyes revealing the fear she still carried. "Thomas will never stop searching. Not for me, perhaps. He would gladly see me dead after the shame I've brought him. But for Samuel. His pride cannot bear the thought of another man's child carrying his name, even if only in rumor." Nizhoni considered her response carefully. The question had occupied her thoughts during the long watches of the night as she sat by the fire, listening for any sound that might herald the approach of their pursuers. Various possibilities had presented themselves, each fraught with its own dangers. "There are settlements to the north and west," she said finally, places where questions are not asked, where a widow and her child might find acceptance. She hesitated before adding, "Or there are my people, what remains of them. The Abenaki who moved beyond the mountains when the English settlements expanded." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. "You would take us to your tribe? Would they accept a white woman and her half-white child?" "They would accept anyone under my protection," Nizhoni said with quiet certainty. "Though the journey would not be easy, especially with an infant. And life there is harder in some ways than what you have known." She studied Elizabeth's face, searching for signs of revulsion or dismissal at the idea. "It would mean leaving behind everything familiar to you, not just Harrowfield, but the ways of your people." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to Samuel, who slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle, a wooden box lined with furs. "Is there truly nothing familiar left to me?" she asked finally, more to herself than to Nizhoni. "My husband has cast me out. The community that once welcomed me now calls me bewitched. The church that baptized me seeks to take my child." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Perhaps the ways of your people could not be more foreign than the cruelty I've found in my own." Before Nizhoni could respond, a sound outside the cabin froze the blood in her veins, the deliberate crunch of footsteps in snow, approaching slowly. Elizabeth heard it too, her face draining of color as she instinctively moved toward Samuel. Nizhoni pressed a finger to her lips, then took up the hunting knife she had found among the cabin's sparse supplies. She moved silently to the door, positioning herself beside it rather than in front of it, her body tense and ready. The footsteps stopped. A moment of silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, then a voice, female, familiar. "Nizhoni, Elizabeth." "It's Hannah Thatcher." Relief coursed through Nizhoni's body, though caution kept her hand on the knife as she opened the door. Hannah stood on the threshold, her face red from cold beneath her woolen hood, a large basket over her arm. Alone, as far as Nizhoni could determine from a quick scan of the surroundings. "Thank Providence you're alive," Hannah breathed, stepping inside as Nizhoni closed the door behind her. "I feared I was too late with my warning." "You came just in time," Elizabeth assured her, the tension visibly draining from her posture. "How did you find us?" "I told her where to send you, didn't I?" Hannah set down her basket, unwrapping her cloak with hands that trembled slightly. From cold or emotion, it was hard to tell. "Though I confess I wasn't certain you'd made it. The search parties have been scouring the woods for 3 days now. We had help," Nizhoni said simply, deciding that Askuk's involvement was better left unmentioned. "What news from Harrowfield?" Hannah's expression darkened as she warmed her hands by the fire. "Nothing good, I'm afraid. Thomas Foster has whipped the town into a frenzy." The tale grows more outlandish with each telling. Now he claims Nizhoni not only bewitched Elizabeth, but transformed a stillborn infant into a living child through unholy rituals. "That's absurd," Elizabeth protested. "Samuel was never stillborn. He was healthy from the moment of his birth." "Truth matters little when fear takes hold," Hannah replied grimly, "and there is fear aplenty in Harrowfield now. Reverend Hayes preached for 3 hours on Sunday about the devil's influence among us. 2 more women have been accused of consorting with Nizhoni for nefarious purposes." Nizhoni's heart sank. "Who?" "Mary Goodwin, for one. Her cow gave sour milk the day after you disappeared, and someone recalled she'd visited your cabin last autumn for a remedy for her husband's cough." Hannah's voice was bitter. "And young Sarah Jenkins. She defended you at the well, said you'd never harmed a soul. By nightfall, she was claimed by Fitz that Reverend Hayes attributes to your lingering influence." Elizabeth sank onto a stool, her face pale. "This is madness." "It is the way of such things," Nizhoni said quietly. Once accusations of witchcraft begin, they spread like fire through dry grass. One suspicion kindles another until the whole field is ablaze. She had seen it before, in other settlements, had heard the stories of Salem and other places where fear had overcome reason, where innocent women had hanged because they were different, because they were vulnerable, because they made convenient scapegoats for a community's accumulated misfortunes. Hannah nodded soberly. Magistrate Collins is expected within the week. His reputation precedes him. He has sent 3 women to the gallows in Lancaster, and his methods of extracting confessions are... She faltered, unable to complete the thought. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire and Samuel's soft breathing. The infant stirred in his sleep, one tiny hand emerging from his wrappings to flex in the air before settling again. "And I've brought supplies," Hannah said finally, gesturing to her basket. "Food, clean linens for the baby, medicines I thought you might need." She hesitated, then added, "and news of a possibility, a chance for escape, perhaps." Both women looked at her expectantly. "My cousin's husband is a ship's captain," Hannah explained. "He sails the coastal trade between Boston and Philadelphia. His vessel is currently icebound in Boston Harbor, but once the spring thaw comes, he plans to sail south. He might be persuaded to take passengers, a widow and her child seeking a fresh start in Philadelphia, perhaps accompanied by a native woman skilled in herbal medicine." Hope flickered briefly in Elizabeth's eyes, quickly tempered by practicality. "That's months away. We cannot remain hidden for so long, not with a search this thorough." "No," Hannah agreed, "but there is a closer haven that might shelter you until then. My cousin herself keeps a small cottage near Salem. Since her husband is often at sea, she has taken in boarders before, women in difficult circumstances." The midwife's meaning was clear. "She is discreet, and the cottage is isolated enough that visitors would not draw undue attention." Nizhoni considered the proposal. Salem held its own dark history with witchcraft accusations, yet the very memory of those tragedies might make its inhabitants more cautious about repeating such mistakes. And if they could reach the coast, perhaps they truly could secure passage on Hannah's cousin's husband's ship when spring came. Philadelphia was a larger city, more diverse, where 3 strangers might disappear into the fabric of society more easily. It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. "How would we reach this cottage?" she asked. "The roads are watched, and we cannot risk another journey through the forest with Samuel." Hannah smiled, a hint of her usual practical confidence returning. "That's where my plan comes in. Thomas Foster and most of the able-bodied men are searching the northern woods, convinced you've fled toward Abenaki territory. But I've arranged for my brother's sleigh to be waiting at the eastern fork of Crampton Road tomorrow at midday. He's a fur trader, often travels with native guides. No one will question him heading east with a native woman and a covered bundle that might contain pelts." "And Elizabeth?" Nizhoni asked. "It will travel separately, as my assistant," Hannah replied. "I've been called to attend a difficult birth in Eastford. It's not unusual for me to bring help, especially in winter when the journey is arduous. No one will look twice at 2 women in my cart, even if one keeps her face well hidden beneath a hood." The plan was clever in its simplicity. By separating them, Hannah reduced the chance of both being captured should one group be discovered. And by using ordinary, explainable journeys as cover, she avoided arousing the suspicion that a more furtive approach might trigger. "It could work," Elizabeth said slowly, hope kindling in her voice for the first time in days. "It must work," Hannah replied with quiet intensity, "for all our sakes." Something in her tone made Nizhoni look at her more closely. "You're in danger too," she realized aloud. "And for helping us," Hannah's lips tightened into a thin line. Let's just say it would be best if I were known to be attending a birth in Eastford when any unfortunate incidents might occur at this cabin. What do you mean? Elizabeth asked, alarm creeping back into her expression. The midwife glanced toward the door, lowering her voice though there was no one to overhear. Thomas Foster and a party of men plan to search this area tomorrow. I overheard them at the tavern. They don't know about the cabin specifically, but they're determined to scour every inch of the forest. She took a deep breath. And they intend to burn any shelter they find, to smoke you out if you're hiding. The implications were clear. If they remained at the cabin, they would be discovered. If they fled into the forest again, they would leave tracks in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Either way, capture seemed almost certain. Then we must leave today, Nizhoni decided, before they arrive. Hannah shook her head firmly. The arrangements are set for tomorrow. My brother cannot reach the meeting point any earlier. He has business in Lancaster today that would arouse suspicion if abandoned. And I cannot take Elizabeth before then without drawing attention. She glanced out the window, where the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Besides, travel after dark in this cold would be a death sentence, especially for the child. Nizhoni paced the small confines of the cabin, her mind racing. There must be another way. A moment of tense silence followed, each woman lost in her own thoughts. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. They must find something when they come, she said, something to convince them we were here but have fled elsewhere. What do you mean? Hannah asked. If they find nothing, they'll continue searching, Elizabeth explained. But if they find evidence that we were here and have moved on, heading north perhaps, as they already suspect, they might focus their efforts in that direction, away from our true path. Nizhoni nodded slowly, understanding dawning. A false trail. Exactly, Elizabeth confirmed. We leave items behind that could only belong to us, perhaps a piece of Samuel's swaddling cloth or one of my hair ribbons. Signs of a hasty departure. And we create tracks heading north toward the Abenaki territories. It was a clever strategy, reminiscent of Askuk's diversion that had allowed them to reach the cabin undetected, but it carried considerable risk. Who would create these tracks? Hannah asked. If you're both to meet my brother and me tomorrow, you cannot be laying false trails to the north. Elizabeth and Nizhoni exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. In the short time they had been thrown together by circumstance, they had developed an understanding that transcended their different backgrounds, a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect. I will do it, Nizhoni said finally. I can move through the forest more easily, create the signs they will look for, then circle back to meet your brother at the Eastern Fork. It's too dangerous, Elizabeth protested. If they catch you, they won't, Nizhoni assured her with more confidence than she felt. I was taught to hunt and to avoid hunters from the time I could walk, and the darkness will be my ally. She glanced toward Samuel, still sleeping peacefully. You and Samuel will remain here with Hannah until morning, then travel as planned to meet her brother. Hannah looked skeptical. You're certain you can reach the meeting point by midday tomorrow? It's a considerable distance, especially if you're doubling back from creating a false trail. I've traveled farther in worse conditions, Nizhoni replied, though in truth she was not at all certain. The forest in winter was unforgiving, and she would be deliberately placing herself near those who wished her harm. But the alternative, remaining at the cabin to be discovered, or attempting to flee with Elizabeth and Samuel through the snow, seemed far more dangerous. I don't like it, Elizabeth said, her eyes betraying her fear despite her composed demeanor. We should stay together. Nizhoni crossed to her, taking her hands in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "This gives us the best chance," she said gently. "For Samuel, Elizabeth, and for his future." At the mention of her son, Elizabeth's resistance visibly crumbled. She glanced at the sleeping infant, then back at Nizhoni, tears welling in her eyes. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "Promise me you'll meet us tomorrow." "I promise," Nizhoni replied, squeezing Elizabeth's hands before releasing them. "Nothing will prevent me from ensuring Samuel's safety. Nothing." As she gathered the few supplies she would need for her night journey, the stone wolf carving Askuk had given her a small pouch of dried meat, a length of rope that might prove useful. Nizhoni was acutely aware of the weight of the promise she had just made. It was not one she took lightly. In her tradition, one's word was sacred, a bond as unbreakable as blood ties. And somewhere deep within, in a place she rarely acknowledged, she knew that her commitment to Samuel and Elizabeth had indeed become as binding as any blood relation. These two lost souls who had come into her life through the most unlikely of circumstances had somehow become her family, not replacing those she had lost, but creating a new circle of belonging in a world that had often left her isolated between two cultures. As darkness fell, Nizhoni prepared to leave, wrapping herself in her warmest cloak and pulling the hood low over her face. Hannah had brought leather bindings for her feet that would provide better traction on the icy ground than her worn moccasins. "Head northeast for 2 miles, then east along the frozen creek," Hannah instructed, sketching a rough map in the ashes by the hearth. "The eastern fork of Crampton Road is marked by a lightning-struck oak. My brother will wait there from midday until sunset, if necessary." Nizhoni committed the directions to memory, then knelt beside Samuel's makeshift cradle. The infant was awake now, his blue eyes seeming to focus on her face with uncanny awareness. "Stay strong, little warrior," she whispered, touching her finger to his cheek. "I will see you tomorrow." Rising, she turned to Elizabeth, who stood by the door, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Without words, the two women embraced briefly, the shared understanding between them requiring no verbal expression. Then Nizhoni slipped out into the gathering darkness, the cold immediately biting at any exposed skin. Behind her, the cabin's door closed, shutting away the warmth and light. Ahead lay the night, the forest, and the dangerous game she was about to play with those who would see her hanged as a witch. She moved silently through the snow, her breath forming clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. The first stars were appearing overhead, ancient lights that had guided her ancestors for countless generations. Nizhoni offered a silent prayer to the spirits of those who had walked this land before her, asking for their protection and wisdom in the hours to come. Then, steeling herself against the cold and the fear that threatened to take root in her heart, she set off to create a trail that would lead her pursuers away from those she had sworn to protect, even if it meant leading those same pursuers directly to herself. The night embraced Nizhoni like an old friend, the darkness offering cover that the daylight would have denied. She moved with practiced stealth, her footfalls deliberate yet light enough to minimize the tracks she left, except where she wanted them found. Near the cabin, she made her presence obvious. A strand of her dark hair caught on a branch, a partial footprint by the door, Samuel's discarded swaddling cloth half buried in snow, as if dropped in haste. The evidence told a story. They had been here, but had fled north in a hurry. Nizhoni worked methodically, creating a trail that would be discovered come morning. She fashioned crude snowshoes from pine branches and rawhide strips from her pack, using them to make tracks that suggested a woman carrying a child accompanied by another woman, tracks heading deliberately northward, toward Abenaki territory as Thomas and the search party already suspected. The bitter cold gnawed at her exposed skin, the temperature dropping steadily as the night deepened. Her fingers grew numb, despite the rabbit fur mittens Hannah had provided. Still, she pressed on, moving deeper into the forest, laying her false trail with the patience of a hunter setting a trap. At a small clearing 2 miles north of the cabin, Nizhoni paused to assess her work. The tracks she'd created were convincing but not too perfect. Desperation would have made their actual flight less careful. She added a final touch, a small fire pit, hastily abandoned, with the remains of burned cloth that might have been used to warm a child. Nearby, she placed Elizabeth's hair ribbon, partially concealed beneath a fallen branch, as if lost unnoticed. The scene complete, Nizhoni turned east, careful now to obscure her own tracks as she moved toward the meeting place Hannah had described. The going was slow, her body weary from days of tension and nights of vigilance. But the thought of Samuel and Elizabeth drove her forward. Their safety depended on her reaching the eastern fork of Crampton Road by midday. Dawn found her halfway to her destination, the first pale light filtering through the bare branches overhead. She paused to rest briefly, consuming a small portion of the dried meat from her pouch and melting snow in her mouth to quench her thirst. The forest around her was eerily silent, the usual morning chorus of birds absent in the deep winter cold. As she prepared to continue her journey, a distant sound froze her in place. Men's voices carried on the still morning air. The search party had found the cabin earlier than expected. Nizhoni pressed herself against the trunk of a massive oak, its rough bark scraping her cheek as she strained to listen. "The ashes are still warm," a voice called. "They cannot have gone far." "Look here," another responded. "Tracks heading north, just as Foster said they would. The Indian woman is taking them to her people." "Spread out," commanded a third voice, Thomas Foster himself, his tone sharp with barely contained rage. "They're traveling with an infant. They'll be slow. We can catch them before nightfall if we move quickly." Nizhoni remained motionless, scarcely breathing, as the sounds of the search party grew fainter. They had taken the bait, following her false trail northward while she continued east. A small victory, but one that might make all the difference. Once certain she was alone again, Nizhoni resumed her journey with renewed urgency. The sun climbed higher in the winter sky, marking the passage of precious hours. She pushed her tired body beyond its limits, ignoring the protests of aching muscles and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. By mid-morning, she reached a frozen creek that matched Hannah's description. Following it eastward, she kept a watchful eye for the lightning-struck oak that would mark her destination. The terrain grew more difficult, the creek cutting through a ravine where the snowdrifts were deeper and the footing treacherous. A fall here, alone in the wilderness, could mean death. Nizhoni moved with increased caution, testing each step before committing her weight. The sun continued its arc across the sky, and anxiety began to gnaw at her. Had she miscalculated the distance? Had Hannah's directions been unclear? Then, rounding a bend in the ravine, she saw it, a massive oak, its upper trunk split and blackened by lightning, standing sentinel at the point where the creek met a narrow road. Relief flooded through her, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees, but the road was empty. No sleigh waited. Nizhoni checked the position of the sun, not yet midday, but close. Hannah's brother had said he would wait from midday until sunset if necessary. Perhaps he was simply not yet arrived, or perhaps a terrible thought struck her. What if Thomas had not sent all his men north? What if some had been dispatched to watch the roads, anticipating an escape attempt? What if Hannah and Elizabeth had been intercepted on their way to this very meeting point? Uncertainty gnawed at her as she found a concealed position from which to watch the road. The oak's massive roots created a natural hollow, shielded from view by thick undergrowth. Nizhoni settled into this space, drawing her cloak tightly around her against the cold, and waited. Midday came and went. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. No sleigh appeared on the road. Nizhoni's mind raced with possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Had Hannah betrayed them? No. The midwife's fear for her own safety had been genuine, her desire to help sincere. Had they been captured? Had something else gone wrong with the plan? As the afternoon wore on, Nizhoni's hope began to fade. The cold seeped deeper into her bones, and exhaustion pulled at her consciousness. She fought against it, pinching her arms and legs to stay awake, reciting prayers and songs from her childhood to keep her mind alert. The sound of approaching hooves jerked her fully awake. Peering cautiously from her hiding place, she saw a sleigh appear around the bend in the road, drawn by a sturdy brown horse. A man wrapped in layers of fur sat at the reins, not Thomas Foster, but a stranger with a full beard liberally frosted with grey. Nizhoni hesitated. Was this Hannah's brother, late but arrived at last? Or was it a trap, a stranger employed by Thomas to lure her out of hiding? The man halted the sleigh near the lightning-struck oak, glancing around with an air of expectation. "Hello!" he called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I come from Hannah Thatcher." Still, Nizhoni did not move. Caution had kept her alive this long. She would not abandon it now. The man sighed, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small package wrapped in cloth. He placed it on a fallen log near the road. "I cannot wait longer," he announced to the seemingly empty forest. "My sister said to leave this for you. Godspeed." With that, he flicked the reins and continued down the road, the sleigh's runners whispering over the packed snow. Only when the sleigh had disappeared from sight did Nizhoni emerge from her hiding place. Her limbs were stiff with cold, and she moved awkwardly toward the log where the package lay. Inside the cloth wrapping, she found a folded note, a small loaf of bread, and a glass vial filled with dark liquid. The note, written in a hasty hand, sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Plans changed. Thomas's men watching roads, Elizabeth and child hidden at Widow Perkins' root cellar. Come after dark. Bring medicine. Samuel ill again. Ch. Nizhoni read the words twice, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. Samuel ill, after all they had done to protect him, after he had fought so hard to survive, and now hidden in a root cellar with Elizabeth, while Thomas's men patrolled the roads. The glass vial contained a tincture Nizhoni recognized, elderberry and willow bark, good for fever, but perhaps not strong enough if Samuel's condition was severe. She tucked it into her pouch alongside the stone wolf carving, her mind already calculating the route to Widow Perkins, home on the eastern edge of Harrowfield. To return to the settlement was to walk willingly into danger. Thomas would have men watching not just the roads, but the homes of anyone who might shelter them. Yet what choice did she have? Samuel needed her, and she had promised Elizabeth she would not abandon them. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, Nizhoni set out once more, her tired body protesting, but her will unbroken. She would reach Harrowfield by nightfall, find the widow's home, and tend to Samuel. Then, somehow, they would continue their journey to safety. The wilderness gave way gradually to cleared land as Nizhoni approached the settlement from the east. She moved from shadow to shadow, using the gathering dusk as cover. Lights began to appear in windows, golden squares against the deepening blue of twilight. Voices carried on the still air, ordinary conversations, a child's laughter, a woman calling someone to supper. The mundane sounds of village life continuing, as if 3 lives did not hang in the balance. Widow Perkins, cottage stood apart from the main cluster of homes, surrounded by an orchard of apple trees, their bare branches etched like black lace against the darkening sky. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the chimney, and a single candle burned in the front window. All appeared peaceful, ordinary, too ordinary, perhaps. Nizhoni hesitated at the edge of the orchard, instinct warning her that something was not right. Why would Hannah direct her to the home of a woman who, according to Hannah herself, had been among those whispering about witchcraft? Why risk bringing Samuel and Elizabeth back into Harrowfield at all, when the plan had been to avoid the settlement entirely? A movement near the cottage caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beside the woodpile, then another near the well. Men moving with the deliberate stealth of hunters who have laid their trap and now wait for their prey to spring it. Nizhoni's breath caught in her throat. This was no sanctuary. It was an ambush. She melted back into the shadows of the orchard, mind racing. If this was a trap, where were Elizabeth and Samuel? Had they been captured already? Or had Hannah's note been forced, written under duress to lure Nizhoni to her doom? A muffled cry from behind the cottage provided a chilling answer. Nizhoni crept closer, using the apple trees as cover, until she could see into the small yard behind the widow's home. There, in the gathering darkness, stood Thomas Foster, one arm locked around Elizabeth's throat, the other holding a pistol. Beside him, Reverend Hayes cradled a bundle that could only be Samuel. "She'll come," Thomas was saying, his voice tight with malice. "The witch won't abandon her devil's bargain, and when she does, we'll have all the proof we need." "This is ungodly, Thomas," the Reverend replied, his tone uncertain. "Using a woman and child as bait." "What's ungodly is allowing a witch to corrupt our community," Thomas snapped. "You saw what happened to the Jenkins girl. Those fits weren't natural. And now 3 more women are showing signs of influence." He tightened his grip on Elizabeth, who whimpered, "My wife may be a whore, but she doesn't deserve to remain under that creature's spell. And this..." He gestured toward the bundle in the Reverend's arms. "This thing is not a child, not a natural one." "Thomas, please," Elizabeth gasped, struggling against his hold. "Samuel is just a baby. He's innocent in all this." "Silence." Thomas shook her roughly. "You lost the right to speak when you spread your legs for another man and tried to pass his bastard off as mine." Nizhoni's blood ran cold at his words, at the naked hatred in his voice. This was a man beyond reason, beyond appeal to compassion or justice. In his mind, he had been wronged, and only blood would balance the scales. She needed to act, but how? Thomas had a pistol, and there were at least 2 other men hidden around the cottage. If she revealed herself, she would be captured instantly. If she fled, Elizabeth and Samuel would remain in Thomas's vengeful hands. A sound behind her made Nizhoni whirl, knife already drawn from her belt. Hannah Thatcher stood there, her face pale in the fading light, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "I didn't betray you," the midwife whispered urgently. "They caught Elizabeth as we tried to leave town, forced me to write that note. I only got away because they thought I was fetching more medicine for the baby." She glanced fearfully toward the cottage. "Thomas is mad with rage. He means to hang you all. Elizabeth for adultery, Samuel for being..." She couldn't finish the thought. "And you came back to warn me?" Nizhoni asked, still wary. Hannah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't leave them to that fate. Not after..." She swallowed hard. "Not after Salem, not again." Understanding dawned. Hannah's earlier reference to blood on her hands had not been hypothetical. She had been part of the Salem witch trials, perhaps as a witness, perhaps as one who had stayed silent when she should have spoken. How many men? Nizhoni asked, accepting the midwife's presence as an unexpected ally. Both five, including Thomas and the Reverend. The others are hiding around the cottage, waiting for you. Hannah's voice trembled. Thomas has convinced them that you'll attempt some magic to free Elizabeth and the child. They're prepared for anything, except perhaps the truth. The truth. That you're no witch, just a woman trying to protect an innocent child and his mother from a man's wounded pride. Hannah's gaze was steady now, resolved. I will testify to that. I will tell everyone how Thomas abandoned his wife's child to die in the snow, how you saved that child at risk to your own life. I will speak this time. The conviction in her voice stirred something in Nizhoni. Hope, perhaps, that not all of Harrowfield was lost to fear and superstition, but hope would not free Elizabeth and Samuel from their immediate peril. We need a distraction, Nizhoni said, thinking rapidly. Something to draw the men away from Elizabeth and the baby, even for a moment. Hannah nodded, reaching into her cloak to withdraw a small clay pot. Oil of wintergreen, she explained, highly flammable. I use it for treating aches, but... She glanced toward the widow's woodpile. Nizhoni understood immediately. A fire would draw the men's attention, create confusion that might allow her to reach Elizabeth and Samuel. It's dangerous, Hannah warned. If the flames spread to the cottage, more dangerous than what awaits them if we do nothing, Nizhoni countered. The midwife's expression hardened with resolve. Tell me what to do. As darkness settled fully over Harrowfield, two women crouched at the edge of an apple orchard, their breath clouding in the frigid air as they prepared to challenge a town's fear with nothing but courage and the truth. The stakes could not have been higher. 3 lives hung in the balance, yes, but also something larger, the choice between surrendering to hatred or standing firm for justice, between allowing fear to rule or insisting on humanity's better nature. Nizhoni touched the stone wolf in her pouch one last time, drawing strength from its smooth surface and all it represented. Then, with a nod to Hannah, she prepared to face whatever fate awaited her at Widow Perkins' cottage. The flame caught quickly when Hannah tipped the oil of wintergreen onto the edge of Widow Perkins' woodpile. At first, just a small flicker, deceptively innocent. Then suddenly, a leaping tongue of fire that climbed the stacked logs with hungry purpose. Hannah retreated swiftly, disappearing into the shadows of the apple orchard as planned, while Nizhoni circled to the opposite side of the cottage, knife in hand, every sense alert for opportunity. The reaction was immediate. A shout went up. Fire! And the men stationed around the cottage rushed toward the growing blaze. Even Thomas Foster's attention wavered, his head turning toward the commotion while his grip on Elizabeth slackened slightly. It was the moment Nizhoni had been waiting for. She emerged from the darkness like a shadow come to life, swift and silent, as she had been taught since childhood. Before Thomas could fully register her presence, she was upon him, the blade of her knife pressed against his throat. "Release her," Nizhoni commanded, her voice low but carrying the unmistakable edge of someone prepared to act. Thomas froze, the pistol still in his hand but now useless against this unexpected threat. Elizabeth, sensing her opportunity, wrenched herself free from his loosened grasp and stumbled toward Reverend Hayes, who still held Samuel. "Give me my son," she demanded, holding out trembling arms. The Reverend hesitated, torn between Thomas's vengeful mission and the natural instinct to reunite mother and child. In that moment of indecision, Samuel began to wail, a healthy, robust cry that cut through the crackling of the growing fire and the shouts of the men attempting to extinguish it. "That sound," Nizhoni said, her knife still at Thomas's throat but her words directed at Reverend Hayes, "is the voice of a child God intended to live. If he had been destined to die in the snow, would he not have taken him before I found him?" Would he have guided my steps to that exact spot, if not to save this innocent life? Doubt flickered across the Reverend's face. For all his religious fervor, he was not immune to the simple logic of her words, nor to the undeniable vitality of the infant in his arms. "She bewitches you even now, Reverend," Thomas hissed, careful not to move against the blade at his throat. "The child was stillborn. I buried it myself. This is some changeling conjured by her heathen magic." "Is that true, Thomas?" came a new voice, Hannah emerging from the shadows to stand beside Elizabeth. "Did you truly bury a stillborn child, or did you take a living, breathing newborn and leave him to die in the snow because your pride couldn't bear another man's son?" "The midwife lies," Thomas spat. "Ah, she's in league with the witch." "I speak only truth," Hannah replied, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding them. "And I am prepared to swear before God and the entire town of Harrowfield that Samuel Foster was born alive and healthy 3 weeks ago. That his father," she pointed an accusing finger at Thomas, "took him from his mother's arms and carried him into the blizzard, saying he was taking him to the church in Lancaster." The Reverend's expression shifted, uncertainty giving way to a dawning horror. "Is this true, Thomas? Did you abandon a living child to the elements?" Before Thomas could respond, the commotion at the woodpile grew louder. The fire had been contained, but in the process, the men had discovered something that sent a ripple of alarm through their ranks. "Reverend Hayes!" called one of them, a stocky farmer named Goodwin. "There's something you should see here." The Reverend, still holding Samuel, moved cautiously toward the woodpile, Elizabeth following close behind, unwilling to let her child out of her sight. Nizhoni kept her knife at Thomas's throat, forcing him to move with her as they joined the growing circle around the partially burned woodpile. There, revealed by the shifting of logs as the men had fought the fire, lay a small bundle wrapped in linen. The cloth was singed at the edges, but the contents were unmistakable. A crude doll made of corn husks and twine, with a lock of hair, Elizabeth's hair, wound around its neck. "Witch's work," someone murmured, but the accusation lacked conviction. "Not mine," Nizhoni said firmly. "I have never been inside this cottage. I have never created such a thing." All eyes turned to Widow Perkins, who had emerged from her home during the commotion and now stood trembling at the edge of the circle. Her thin face was ashen, her eyes wide with fear. "Martha," the Reverend questioned, his voice heavy with dread. "What is the meaning of this?" The widow's lips quivered, no words emerging. Then, unexpectedly, another voice spoke up, a young woman at the back of the gathering crowd that had formed as the commotion drew more of Harrowfield's residents from their homes. "It was Thomas Foster who asked her to make it," Sarah Jenkins said, stepping forward despite the trembling of her limbs. The same Sarah who had allegedly fallen victim to fits attributed to Nizhoni's influence. "He came to her 3 days ago, offering payment if she would create something that could be used as evidence against the Indian woman." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas stiffened against Nizhoni's blade. "The girl is confused," he insisted. "Her mind affected by the witches." "I am not confused," Sarah interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "And then I am not bewitched. The fits were false. Thomas told me what to do, how to act, said it would serve God's purpose to rid our community of the heathen influence." Her gaze found Nizhoni's across the crowd. "I am ashamed of my deception. I ask forgiveness." The crowd's murmur grew louder, confusion and shock rippling through the gathered villagers. Reverend Hayes looked from the corn-husk doll to Thomas, his expression hardening. "You fabricated evidence of witchcraft?" he asked, the question heavy with the weight of its implication. "You used our faith, our genuine fear of the devil's influence, to serve your own vengeful purpose." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "What does it matter how the witch is exposed, so long as she burns for her crimes? She has corrupted my wife, stolen my child, not your child." Elizabeth cut in, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "Never your child, Thomas. You knew that from the moment I began to show. You knew the timing was wrong." She stepped forward, reaching for Samuel, whom the Reverend now surrendered without protest. "And you decided that if you could not claim him as yours, then he should not live at all." A heavy silence fell over the gathering. In this deeply religious community, adultery was a serious sin, but the deliberate murder of an innocent child was an abomination beyond comprehension. Nizhoni, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, cautiously lowered her knife from Thomas's throat. Though she remained vigilant for any sudden movement, the immediate danger had passed. A different kind of judgment was now forming in the collective mind of Harrowfield. "Me, Reverend," she said quietly, "I am no witch. I am a healer, using knowledge passed down through generations of my people. I found Samuel in the snow, surrounded by wolves, and I carried him to safety. I tended his mother when she came searching for him, half dead from cold and grief. These are not acts of evil, but of compassion." She met his gaze steadily. "Judge me by my deeds, not by your fears." The Reverend held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "The scripture tells us, 'By their fruits ye shall know them.' I have seen no evil fruit from your works, only a child saved from certain death." He turned to Thomas, his voice hardening. "But I have seen plenty of evil fruit from yours, Thomas Foster. You would take the word of a savage over one of your own flock," Thomas demanded, desperation edging his voice. "I would take the word of truth over lies, no matter the source," the Reverend replied. He looked to the men who had been part of the search party. "Restrain him. He will be held for the magistrate's judgment, not for accusations of witchcraft, but for the attempted murder of an innocent child." Two men moved to seize Thomas, but with the desperation of a cornered animal, he broke free, lunging toward Elizabeth and Samuel with a cry of incoherent rage. His hand still clutched the pistol, raising it toward them in one fluid motion. Nizhoni did not hesitate. She threw herself forward, colliding with Thomas just as the pistol discharged. The sound was deafening in the night air, the flash momentarily blinding. Pain exploded in Nizhoni's shoulder as the ball found flesh, but her momentum carried both her and Thomas to the ground. Then many things happened at once. Men rushed forward to subdue Thomas, wrenching the pistol from his grasp. Elizabeth screamed Nizhoni's name, clutching Samuel protectively to her chest. Hannah knelt beside the fallen healer, her practiced hands already moving to assess the wound. "Not deep," Hannah announced after a tense examination. The ball passed through the flesh of her shoulder. "With proper care, she will heal." Nizhoni, dazed from pain and the sudden release of tension, looked up to see Elizabeth kneeling beside her, tears streaming down her face. Samuel, surprisingly calm despite the chaos, regarded her with wide blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond his few weeks of life. "You saved him again," Elizabeth whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "At risk of your own life," Nizhoni managed a small smile despite the burning pain in her shoulder. "He is worth saving," she replied simply. As Hannah worked to bind the wound, the crowd of villagers began to disperse, their urgent whispers carrying speculation about Thomas's fate and the reversal of the witchcraft accusations. Reverend Hayes remained, his face grave, as he watched the midwife tend to Nizhoni. "You will need a place to recover," he said finally. "The church has a small room adjoining the meeting house. It is humble but warm. You would be welcome there until your strength returns." The offer surprised Nizhoni, though she was careful not to show it. "And after I recover, will I be welcome to return to my cabin at the forest's edge?" The Reverend's expression was thoughtful. "There will always be those who fear what they do not understand," he said carefully. "But perhaps, in time, understanding may grow where fear once took root." He glanced at Elizabeth and Samuel. "And what of you, Mrs. Foster? What will you do now?" Elizabeth looked down at her son, then at Nizhoni. The bond between them, forged in danger and deepened through shared purpose, was visible to all who cared to see it. "I still hope to reach my sister in Salem," she said, "and from there, perhaps Philadelphia, as Hannah suggested, a place where Samuel can grow without the shadow of this night following him." She hesitated, then added softly, "I had hoped Nizhoni might consider coming with us." Nizhoni, despite the pain clouding her thoughts, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her wound. The idea of remaining with Elizabeth and Samuel, of watching the infant grow into a child and then a man, held an appeal she had not anticipated when she first found him in the snow. Yet there was something else to consider: her connection to this land, to the forest that had been her home and sanctuary. The thought of leaving it behind, of traveling to a city where the rhythms of nature would be muted beneath the noise of human commerce, gave her pause. "And first, let her heal," Hannah interjected practically, finishing the bandage with a secure knot. "Such decisions need not be made tonight." As they helped Nizhoni to her feet, the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. The longest night was ending, giving way to a new day filled with possibilities none of them could have imagined when darkness fell. The spring came early that year, the snow retreating before March winds to reveal the first tentative green shoots pushing through the dark earth. In the small Philadelphia household near the Cooper's workshop, windows stood open to welcome the fresh air and sunshine. Nizhoni moved quietly through the kitchen garden, her fingers gently examining the leaves of the herbs she had planted weeks earlier. Her shoulder had healed well, though it still ached sometimes before rain. The journey from Harrowfield had been long and not without hardship, but they had made it, she, Elizabeth, and Samuel, arriving in Philadelphia as the first crocuses bloomed. Elizabeth's sister had welcomed them with open arms, her husband finding work for Elizabeth transcribing documents with her fine, educated hand. They lived modestly but comfortably, far from the whispers and suspicions of Harrowfield. As for Thomas Foster, word had reached them through Hannah's correspondence that he had been tried and found guilty, not of attempted murder, as might have been just, but of the lesser crime of child abandonment. His punishment had been a public whipping and banishment from the township, a sentence that reflected the community's ambivalence about punishing one of their own too harshly, even for so grievous an offense. The witchcraft accusations had died with his disgrace, though Nizhoni harbored no illusions that Harrowfield's fear of the unfamiliar had been permanently laid to rest. Such fear ran too deep in the human heart to be extinguished by a single revelation of truth. "Nizhoni!" Elizabeth's voice called from the house. "Samuel is awake from his nap." Setting aside her gardening tools, Nizhoni made her way inside, wiping her hands on her apron. In the small sitting room, Elizabeth sat with Samuel on her lap, the infant, now nearly 5 months old, reaching with curious fingers for the pages of the book his mother had been reading. "He grows more inquisitive by the day," Elizabeth remarked with a smile, "just like his father." It was a measure of how far they had come that Elizabeth could now speak of John Winthrop without pain clouding her features. The scholar had never learned of his son's existence, having returned to Boston and then sailed for England before Samuel's birth. Perhaps it was better that way, Elizabeth had decided. A clean break, a fresh beginning. "All children are born curious," Nizhoni replied, taking a seat beside them. "Or it is the world that teaches them fear and doubt." She offered her finger to Samuel, who grasped it with surprising strength, his blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away. Elizabeth watched them, her expression softening. "He knows you," she said quietly. "Knows you saved him. Children remember such things in their souls, even if their minds do not." Nizhoni nodded, though she was not entirely convinced. What she did believe, with increasing certainty, was that Samuel had been placed in her path for a purpose, not by any Christian god or even by the great spirit of her own tradition, but by the mysterious workings of a universe where all things were connected in ways beyond human understanding. Her life had been irrevocably changed by finding a half-frozen infant in the snow. Her path had been redirected from solitude in the forest to this shared existence in a city far from her homeland. Sometimes she missed the quiet communion with nature, the freedom to move through the woods without constraint. But then Samuel would look at her as he did now, with absolute trust and recognition, and she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. "I received a letter from Hannah today," Elizabeth said, reaching for a folded paper on the table beside her. "She says the new midwife in Harrowfield is young and inexperienced. The women ask for her by name, but secretly inquire after your remedies." A smile touched her lips. "It seems your reputation has outlived the accusations against you." "Knowledge survives where fear would destroy it," Nizhoni observed. "It always has." She had been teaching Elizabeth the properties of various herbs, showing her how to prepare the remedies that had been passed down through generations of her people. It was a small way of ensuring that this wisdom would not die with her, that something of her heritage would continue even as the world changed around them. Samuel squirmed in his mother's lap, making the small sounds that indicated hunger. As Elizabeth prepared to feed him, Nizhoni rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the busy street beyond their small garden. Philadelphia was so different from the forest she had known, crowded, noisy, filled with the constant bustle of commerce and human interaction. Yet it offered something her isolated cabin could not: anonymity, the freedom to exist without the weight of others, preconceptions. Here, she was simply Nizhoni, a woman who lived with a young widow and her child, who grew medicinal herbs and occasionally assisted those in need of healing. No witch, no threat, no outsider to be feared, just another thread in the complex tapestry of the growing city. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but as she watched Elizabeth nursing Samuel, his tiny hand resting against her breast, Nizhoni felt a sense of rightness that transcended her occasional homesickness for the forest. She reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the stone wolf carving Askuk had given her that night in the forest. She carried it always, a tangible connection to her past, a reminder of who she had been and the journey that had brought her here. "One day," she said softly, moving back to sit beside Elizabeth and Samuel, "when he is old enough to understand, we will tell him the story of how he came to be here. How he was born between worlds, saved from wolves, carried through snow, and guarded by two women who found in him a purpose greater than themselves." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Ooh. And we will tell him that sometimes the greatest magic is not in spells or potions, but in the simple, human choice to protect what is innocent, to stand against cruelty, to see value in a life others would discard." Samuel, sated from nursing, gazed up at them both with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ages. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light or the natural solemnity of infants, but in that moment, Nizhoni could almost believe he understood everything they said. Outside, the sounds of the city continued, cartwheels on cobblestones, merchants calling their wares, children laughing as they played in the spring sunshine. Inside, in the quiet of their small home, three souls bound by circumstance and choice created their own sanctuary, their own definition of family. And if some in Harrowfield still whispered about the Indian witch who had stolen a child and disappeared into the wilderness, if some crossed themselves when passing the abandoned cabin at the forest's edge, it mattered little to those who knew the truth. For truth, like the spring that follows even the harshest winter, has a power all its own, a power to heal, to transform, and ultimately to redeem.